Welcome to week 2 of our No Ordinary Child series, where we take a look at the early lives of some of the most important people in the Bible. Moses, Samuel, John the Baptist, and Jesus. It's a veritable who's who of spiritual significance in the Bible. So how do we lead off a message with such significance and gravitas? We're going to examine what the best year was to be born. You may be thinking this sounds like an interesting sociological research project, Brad. What are we going to look at? Gross domestic product? Standard of living? Life expectancy? Some measure of happiness? No. We're looking for a measure that we all care about, despite it barely mattering. We're going to look when the best time was to be born from a quality of the Disney movies in your childhood standpoint. You know, kind of the movies of my childhood are better than the movies of your childhood type thing. And there are bar charts, so get excited. All right, first in the spirit of Zane, sitting right there, now being old enough to do a science project, we're going to start with a hypothesis. Here it is. My hypothesis is that the best year to be born for quality Disney movies of your childhood is 1982. Translated hypothesis, this is the year I was born. Yes, I know. And I feel very sorry for you poor people who had to deal with the likes of Pocahontas and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. I will pray for you, but I feel the damage is already done. So here's how this is going to work. I'm measuring how good a movie is using its Rotten Tomatoes score. I'm using critics rating, not user rating. We're not barbarians. We're only looking at animated Disney movies, and I'm counting movies that came out from the age of 5 to the age of 12 as what counts as your childhood. Why these ages, you ask? Well, Lion King came out when I was 12. That's the last one I count for me. Right. And 5 feels like about as early as we might have seen it in the theater and actually remember it later. Don't agree with the age range of the methodology? Well, there was actually unanimous agreement with the entire research and analysis team that this was the best approach. So on behalf of the entire team, I regret nothing. All right, here are the results. Chart number 1. So, I am there in the orange, 1982. As you can see, I'm doing pretty good, but not number 1. The best, it appears, to be 1986 from this measure. The travesty of Pocahontas and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, which did pull the numbers down, were not as bad as Oliver and Company and Investors Down Under. Which apparently counted my number, and I had no idea. Who made these rules? I would like to say that there are better ways to do this data that support my hypothesis, but they're not. It only gets worse from here for the year of 1982. Let's say more than just Disney animated movies are counted. Pixar showed up in 1995 and consistently crushed it from a Rotten Tomatoes standpoint. All the movies that don't start with the word cars were very highly rated. Here's how the data looks with all of those movies included. In case you didn't know, Pixar started out separate, then got bought by Disney later. So now they're all the same, but back then they were not. So now I'm looking even worse. The best year is now 1987. The trouble with 1982 is if you only go to 12, you don't get to count a single one of the Pixar movies and the regular Disney movies from a Rotten Tomatoes standpoint. All right, if we want to get even more complete, you can add in DreamWorks, so we get all the Shreks, Prince of Egypt, and some other things in the mix. It actually looks pretty much about the same from where the best one is. You can see they all kind of shifted down, but DreamWorks isn't as good. And then lastly, if we decide that what really matters isn't the average score, but the quantity of good animated movies that came out during your childhood, say greater than 80% score, and this is probably what I think is the most accurate, it looks like this. Whoa. And now you can see that 1982 is tied to the worst. And it's apparently best to be born in either 2004 or 2005. So the 13, 14-year-olds out there are the envy of us all. All right, so my hypothesis was disproven in every way I can think of. And despite the great run of The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King that I was hanging my hat on, my childhood being the best, Pixar crushed my dreams with its consistently good movies. And since I spent way too much time going through animated movie data, check out these movies that have surprisingly really high Rotten Tomatoes scores. Chicken Run and Wallace and Gromit. That apparently also won a Best Animated Movie Academy Award in 2005. I've never even heard of it. So anyway, potentially something to check out that I assume most people haven't seen. Anyway, I think Ants is on Netflix. I looked yesterday. So, through all of this, we have concluded that it is best to be born in 2004 or 2005, and it may actually be true that those are some of the last years that have like go all the way through year 12 because they're 13 and 14. It could just be that from a quantity of good movie standpoint that it's just getting bigger and bigger. And I didn't even put in some of the newer studios, like none of the Despicable Me's got counted because they're Sony, I guess. I thought there were DreamWorks did not. So anyway, and these kids born in 2004, 2005, they don't even know how good they have it. And I think this is kind of a common thing in all of our lives. There are things that we are born into that are completely out of our control, that can greatly shape our lives, possibly even more than how good the Disney movies are. And we're looking at a person today, Samuel, whose life was shaped by promises and decisions that were made before he was even born. But what about those of us who aren't the result of a promise to God, who aren't destined to serve him from birth like Samuel was? You know, us normal people. How do we know what God wants from us? How do we live with him and hear his voice in our lives? And is this something that's available to us too, or just children of promise? How can we as ordinary children be like Samuel, who, as we have said and as we titled this series, was no ordinary child? We're going to find these things out this morning, and we'll start where many of the stories of the Old Testament start, with a messed up but religious and God-fearing family. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah in the region of Zuph. I'm not sure if that's how you say Zuph. In the hill country of Ephraim. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Heaven's armies at the tabernacle. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children, and though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion, because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her, because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. So it's obviously kind of weird when we read about the polygamy in the Old Testament, but doesn't it seem like every time they get into these kind of like family dynamics and how they interacted, that it's like awful and the wives despise each other and make each other jealous? So first bit of application this morning, let's stick to one wife and one husband going forward. How about that? I'm even going to say no adultery. Let's put that out there. That's in the Ten Commandments, shouldn't be controversial. I think we can agree on that. All right, so this is a messed up situation. Hannah is embarrassed. She's sad and desperate. And really, no one likes Peninnah after that thing. She sounds pretty awful. This is a pretty rough, only time to be mentioned in the Bible for her. Not very good press. Anyway, let's see what happens next. It says, once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli, the priest, was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. So for a little background, Hannah is making this vow at the tabernacle. This is the precursor to the temple in Jerusalem. It is where the Ark of the Covenant is housed. So in that time, it is where the literal presence of God is. And she is possibly as close as she could get into the tabernacle, into God's presence. So she's making a vow to God that she will give her firstborn if he lets her have a child. And that last piece about his hair never being cut, that should sound somewhat familiar. When we do Judges last summer, 2 summers ago, or from your stories as a child. Samson was another person who didn't have his hair cut. So this basically means she's saying the child will follow the Nazirite vows, which again is most well known in Samson's story. It's no cutting hair, no drinking intoxicating drinks like alcohol, and also not touching dead things. Samson broke that one regularly, just as an aside, by killing the things first off. This shows that they are specially set apart for God. And let's see how it worked out, her giving this vow at the tabernacle. It says, when Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. All right, so when it's Hannah's night, in whatever way their weird polygamous relationship works, she conceives. Her prayer is answered and Samuel is born. And this next part, I think, often gets glossed over when we're reading the story in the Bible because, of course, the person in the Bible fulfills the vow that they made to God. But giving up your one and only son, sound familiar? When previously not being able to bear children, and especially because at the time, being able to bear children and bear sons was huge to how a wife was valued by the society and by their husband. And even further, a son for a woman is their provider once their husband passes away. So it's also, not only is Hannah giving up this child that she loves and values, she's also giving away her future security. So while this sounds plenty hard to our ears, it's likely even harder for where Hannah is in her life. But we see Hannah's faithfulness in this next passage. It says, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. Sir, do you remember me? Hannah asked. I am the very woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. Now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord his whole life. And they worshiped the Lord there. So not only does Hannah follow through, but she's grateful and joyful for what God has done in her life. And her part of the story essentially ends here, but she has shown great faith and kept her vow before the Lord. And later on we hear that the Lord blessed Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And we don't hear anything else about Peninnah, the previously more fertile but also mean wife. If this were a Disney movie, it would not end well for her. All right. So we have Samuel. He has been dedicated to God from before his birth. He now lives at the temple with the judge and high priest at the time, Eli. Eli also has 2 sons who are also priests, who would normally succeed him in his roles. More on them later. We read this about Samuel as he grows. It says, but Samuel, though he was only a boy, served the Lord. He wore a linen garment like that of a priest. Meanwhile, Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. And meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew taller and grew in favor with the Lord and with the people. So I obviously jumped around there. That's why you got one thing starting with a but and 2 meanwhiles. The reason for that is because through that whole section, it's talking about how terrible Eli's sons are. In a word from verse 12, it says they are scoundrels, which I think is a funny word. But Samuel, in contrast, serves the Lord. He grows up in God's presence. He is faithful and true. So the son of the high priest, Eli's 2 sons, who were scoundrels, they had roughly the same upbringing that Samuel did, likely with even more privilege and favor from their father. And because of their different choices, Eli's sons are scoundrels, and Samuel grows in favor with the Lord and with the people. And against this backdrop, the main scene that we want to look at and talk about happens. Here it is. It says, one night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. Suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied. What is it? He got up and ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, Eli replied. Go back to bed. So he did. Then the Lord called out again, Samuel. Again Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, my son, Eli said. Go back to bed. Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. So the Lord called a 3rd time. And once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? Then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So he said to Samuel, go and lie down again, and if someone calls again, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed. And the Lord came and called as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel replied, speak, your servant is listening. I have pretty vivid memories from when I was growing up and I heard this story for the first time. That night in bed, young, probably 6 or 7-year-old me was saying to God, "Speak, your servant is listening." Probably with a different translation. I don't know what I would have. Because I wanted to hear from God like Samuel did. And I think we all kind of want this. I think part of it is that we want more certainty than is inherent in belief in a God that we don't see physically or hear audibly. But it just seemed so great to me at the time, like a young boy who heard from God in the night. And it didn't happen. No audible voice of God for a young 6 or 7-year-old Brad came through. So I think where this leaves us is that this is a pretty cool story of how God spoke to his most chosen servant of a generation. Samuel would go on to be a prophet, a judge and a leader of Israel, and essentially, it seems, had pretty clear two-way communication with God much of the time. But I want to focus on two things from the story that I think matters. The first one is that this happening was extraordinary. In the text, we read that Samuel did not yet know the Lord because he had never had a message from the Lord before. And the verse before this whole section reads, "Meanwhile, the boy Samuel served the Lord by assisting Eli. Now in those days, messages from the Lord were very rare, and visions were quite uncommon." So what I want us to take from this is that it is fine and normal if you don't hear God's voice audibly, and I would say that you are in the vast majority of Christians, both now and historically. If you do hear God's voice audibly, that is also awesome. But don't feel that if you aren't hearing God's voice literally talking to you or audibly in your ear, that you're somehow lesser than those who are or who claim to be. Even in this story, there are faithful people, Hannah for one, who we see no evidence of God speaking to audibly, despite her being an active participant in God's plans. And the second thing I want to pull from that story is Samuel's response to God. "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." Now, while in this story this is applied to a person who audibly hears the voice of God, I pray that this would be at the center of all of our hearts, a desire to hear and know the words of God and the obedience implied by being called his servant. "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," is saying that we are not just servants, but servants of a master who we know is good, who we know is wise, who we know loves us, and as a result, we will obey, because when we know what the master wants us to do, when we know his voice, then we know what is right. We know what is good for us to do, and we know what we can do that has eternal value. And I think we are all pretty wired to want this sort of thing, to know that what we're doing matters. Especially in a big and eternal sense, and to depend on a God or a leader who is worthy of being followed. But even if we have this attitude of "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," what do all of us who don't hear his voice audibly do? It's pretty straightforward when you get a booming voice or a written message, "Go do this." But what about the rest of us? So first, I'll share some quotes from the best thing I've read or listened to lately on this topic. This is from Bob Goff's book, Love Does. And if you have the book or borrow it, this is from the chapter called Hearing Aid. I believe this is available in the DR store, which I am told will be set up here before we are done. All right, it says, "When I listened for God's voice, I didn't hear anything. No cosmic whispers, no movie reels with subtitles, no still small voice, no booming voice. It's not that I haven't asked God to talk to me. I've asked for a paragraph, a sentence, a phrase, a word. I've even asked if I could buy a vowel. Yet still I haven't heard a thing. So rather than spending time wondering why I don't hear audible voices, I try to listen harder with my heart. And I've realized a couple things that seem kind of obvious now. God doesn't talk to me in an audible voice because God isn't a human being. He's God. That makes sense to me because human beings are limited and God isn't limited at all. He can communicate to us in any way he wants to, anytime he wants to. Through flowers, other people, an uncomfortable sense, a feeling of joy, goosebumps, a newfound talent, or an appreciation. It doesn't need to be a big mystical thing. So I think that the reality is that God communicates to us all the time. It's just not often in his own audible voice. Here's an example. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I don't plan these messages out very far in advance. I know that may be surprising. Those of you who work with me on teaching team are not surprised at all. So for instance, I didn't go research who has some good stuff on hearing God's voice in your life like a month and a half ago or 2 months ago. But I have for years heard how great and life-changing a book Love Does is. And other random things. So for some reason, I don't even remember now, I signed up for Audible's free trial because Zane needed some book. I think he was going somewhere, needed to listen, or I don't know, whatever. And I didn't cancel it for a long time. The way it works, you get a free credit every month. So I had 5 of them, and I wasted a bunch of money. Not good. But among other things, I was going through and looking at what books I could get. I was like, oh yeah, Love Does is supposed to be good. So I downloaded that Audible book, started listening to it about a month and a half ago. At the time, I had been signed up for this message, but really had no idea what I was going to say. Liked the topic, but hadn't really done any work on it. And when I got into it and started planning, I remembered a really good chapter in this book I listened to on this topic. So in this case, God didn't need to audibly talk to me because a guy named Bob, about 8 years ago or something like that, who lives nowhere near here, wrote a book. And he wrote a chapter in the book about this exact thing, about not hearing God's voice audibly. So all God needed to do for the underprepared speaker in Tucson to hear what he needed to hear was to get me to read or listen to Bob's book. Could he have piped it directly into my ears or my brain? Sure, he could have done that. But he didn't need to, because he can speak to me however he wants, whenever he wants. Even when I don't know it's God's voice, I need to be saying, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening," because he is talking to me when I don't even realize it. Another example for me, and I want to warn people, much like how not everyone hears God's voice audibly, God can speak to you in a lot of different ways, and it can be completely different than how I feel like he speaks to me. And that's one of my biggest points that I want us to take from that quote, that he can communicate to us in any way he wants to, anytime he wants to. So another time when I often feel like God is communicating to me is during worship at church, which we just had. For whatever reason, during worship, I get pretty clear thoughts on messages that I have coming up, ideas for future messages, ideas of how to do a better job loving and raising my kids, ideas about ways I can be doing better ministry, how I can love and treat people better at work. I find myself better able to empathize with people who frustrate me. It's good. I believe it is because God is more present during these times, or that I am more attuned to his presence, which may be just as likely. It could also be that this is one of the few times where I don't feel rushed, or feel like I have a million things to do, which lends to the point that I also have similar experiences on airplanes when I'm quiet and not rushed and really can't do anything except for sit on the airplane until I get there. And maybe this is something you can relate to, maybe it's not. I'm an introvert. This feels like a pretty introverted way of discerning God's voice and communication. But if that's no good for you, here are other ways that God may speak to you. Again, there's probably an endless list. He can speak to you through a friend, through a message, one that you listen to audibly. It could be a message from years ago. It could be one at church. He can do it through the Bible, which is kind of the point. Through a book that you read, through a Christian movie, through a secular movie, through a song, through nature. He can speak to you by seeing how a parent loves their child, through a person in need, through someone helping you when you're in need. He can put thoughts in your head. He can communicate through a feeling, through a dream when you're asleep, through a dream when you're awake of what the world can be. He can communicate through overhearing a conversation in a coffee shop. He can communicate through art. Yes, he can communicate audibly if he chooses. And really, almost everything that we do at these services are ways that God can communicate with you. We worship him, we give messages, we read scripture, we spend time in reflection. So all ways that we connect to God and that we can communicate with him. And to reiterate, he can communicate to us in any way he wants to, at any time he wants to. So even without audible words, God is speaking to us. We need to be people who say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." All right, 1.5 points left, and then we'll close up. One thing that is very important with all the ways that God can talk to us is discerning when it's him. Part of what's great about Samuel's situation is it's very clear. He's the speak, Lord, I listen to you, he keeps talking, so that sounds pretty good. And I think this is actually, especially when it's not the audible voice, this is much easier in retrospect. Like with listening to Love Does, clearly it's God-centered, and God can and is speak to me through this book, almost regardless of what's coming up in my life. But how it was exactly what I needed for a message coming up is only evident after the fact. The check of sorts comes from how things fit into what we know to be true about God's character. This is another quote from Love Does about how to get an idea of this sort of thing. It says, I take the fixed points in his character and my particular hardwiring, and I extrapolate from there. There are plenty of fixed points. There are letters written from prison cells and gospel accounts about how God sees the world and sees us. There are accounts of what Jesus said and what he didn't say. So basically what Bob is getting at is the ways God communicates to us will be in line with what we already know about his character and what we see from the Bible. Those letters from the prison cells are the epistles of the New Testament. Think Romans, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, all of those. The gospel accounts and accounts of what Jesus said and didn't say are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We can learn so much about what God wants us to know about him by reading and studying the Bible. And this foundation will be a big part of what helps us understand when God is communicating with us in other ways. And for the last point, I'll bring us back to 6 to 7-year-old Brad, who wanted to hear God's voice like Samuel did when I heard this story for the first time. I think there's a big part of wanting this back then that had to do with wanting something supernatural to happen, wanting to hear God's voice for the magic and novelty of it. And this isn't what God is interested in. He wants to be with us. He wants us to know him. He wants us to spend time with him and for us to live our lives with him. God is not interested in giving us a grand purpose and then never talking to us again, or only checking in from time to time. He wants to be with us all the time. And this is what we should be looking for too. Not just purpose, which following God and discerning his voice can give us, but the real prize. The real prize is God himself and in a life lived with him. Focusing on being with God and getting to know him also makes discerning his voice easier. Similar to how you know what your good friends or spouse will say before they say it, or you can pick them out from far away based on their silhouette or how they walk. Spending time with God and knowing him brings a similar familiarity and recognition. And it also helps majorly with becoming more like God. Have you noticed how you start to talk like your friends or your spouse or really anyone that you spend a lot of time with? The same can and will happen with God. Spend time with him and you will begin to change. Change in ways that will align your life and your character with God. All right, I've used up my time and we only got to chapter 3 in 1 Samuel. There's all kinds of good stuff in here that I considered putting in and did not for time purposes. It's certainly worth a read. Even just the follow-on piece of what God actually says to Samuel when he speaks to him for the first time is really interesting. And it kind of makes you rethink wanting God to speak to you audibly. All right, I'm going to spoil it. Still go read this though. God tells Samuel that he's going to overthrow Eli's family line as the priest of Israel. So Eli's like his father figure, kind of, his mentor of sorts. And then the next day, because remember, Eli knew that Samuel was being talked to by God, Eli asked Samuel what God said to him with the unkind caveat of, and may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me. So Samuel has been spoken to audibly by God exactly once, and then he gets, may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me. Yikes. So quick aside, that this probably deserves more time. God won't always just be comforting and encouraging in the messages that he has for us. He may ask you to do things that range from uncomfortable all the way to dangerous. And having the heart of a servant isn't easy in these moments. We need to decide first that when we know or suspect it's God communicating, that we're people who listen. That we're people who follow God and do what he asks of us. Anyway, there's tons of interesting stuff in there in 1 Samuel. Also, check out Love Does. It's really good and covers a lot more than just what I talked about here. This was one chapter out of 31, and there's plenty of more good stuff even in this chapter on this topic. There's a lot of stuff about what's God's plan for my life and things like that, which I think most of us are pretty interested in. But as you leave, I want you to remember two things. I repeated them a fair bit, so hopefully they haven't faded away yet. First, God can communicate to us in any way he wants to, at any time he wants to. It's up to us to learn to recognize his voice and to listen. And speaking of, we should have the same attitude in response to God that Samuel had, which is, speak, Lord. Your servant is listening.